I'm Renee Williams.
And I'm Billy Thomas.
And welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. You know, there's a lot of issues that landowners face when it comes to their trees. And so you are going to talk a little bit about that.
We are, Dr. Crocker and myself have put together a presentation to talk about some of the common tree-related issues that landowners face here in Kentucky. And really, we kind of drew from the questions that we get on a regular basis. And obviously, we can't cover them all with 10 questions, but these are some of the more common ones. And we also have Cody Jarrett on with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. He's going to be talking about a cedar management workshop that's coming up a little later in the month. So we want to give him a chance to kind of let us know what's going on there. Certainly we have a lot of cedar trees in central Kentucky for sure, and northern Kentucky as well. So it's an important topic for a lot of folks. So we'll have Cody on a little bit later, but we're excited to have everybody with us today. Thank you for joining us. If you're on Zoom, you can use the chat function to interact with us. And if you're on YouTube, thanks for being there as well. And you can send us an email at ukforestry.org and we can get you a response that way. But glad to have everybody with us today.
Yeah, we greatly appreciate it. So let's go ahead and get started because I know you and Dr. Crocker have a lot to talk about. Hi, Ellen, how are you today?
Hey, everyone. Great to be on and to talk about trees with you.
Go trees.
Go trees. They're always the answer, right?
What are those top 10 tree issues? I guess we started with number one.
Go ahead, Ellen. Sorry.
You tell the two of us to come up with top 10 tree issues. And there are so many questions that we receive. And so this is something where Billy and I kind of thought about it for a while. We're like, what are the top questions that we get, that we see, and what are some starting places for folks? Because each one of these we could talk about all day, but we're going to scratch the surface with some general tips for some of the most common questions that we receive. Does that, capture what you were thinking, Billy, as well?
Yes, ma'am. I think that's a great approach. Yeah, there's a lot of common issues that people run into across the state. And as Dr. Crocker was saying, we receive a lot of input or questions from people all across Kentucky related to trees. And, hopefully these will touch on some of the things that you may be thinking about in your trees. But I'm delighted to be here with Dr. Crocker talking about the top 10 tree issues for landowners.
Well, should we start it out? Issue number one. All right. The first issue, the one that I get all the time is, what is this tree or plant or flower or fungus? But in this case, we're talking about trees. I think that's a really important starting place for a lot of folks, because if you don't know what the species are, it can be really hard to determine, is that what you want? Is it looking good? Are there problems? So figuring out what something is kind of the first step a lot of times.
It is, and it can be challenging when we have so much diversity here in the state. Dr. Crocker, there's like 120 native tree species. So, we've got like 20 plus species of oak. So it can be challenging to kind of separate, one species from another for sure.
Oh, yeah. And don't get me started on some of the hickories, trying to distinguish them. It's tricky even for the professionals. Plus, then if you're in an urban landscape, there's a whole bunch of other species that aren't native to here, might be coming from other parts of the world. Many of them are wonderful landscape trees. Some of them can be invasive problems. And so that number just multiplies. There's so many different things out there. So it's really a challenge. And one thing that we wanted to encourage you all, that if you're trying to figure out what things are, use the resources that you've got. And one of those great resources that everybody's got is the smartphone, right? This phone in your pocket all the time. You can take really high quality photos to help you identify things. Now, I said high quality photos because it's really hard to identify things if you've got some photos that aren't very helpful. You can share those with the most knowledgeable person, but they're not going to be able to steer you in the right direction. So that's kind of where I encourage you to think about what are some of the tree attributes that you need to be capturing, that whether you're using a key, a booklet, you're emailing those to someone, you're posting them online, will get you the information you want. So some of the things that come to mind, Billy, what kind of photos do you generally get sent when somebody wants to know what a tree is?
You were talking about the cameras on our phones nowadays, and I'm so glad they've gotten better, Dr. Crocker, because not
Oh my
long
gosh.
ago we were getting such blurry photos, and and you just get like random parts of a tree, and it can be challenging, or somebody might just send you a leaflet off of a whole leaf, so you could get some of that stuff that makes it really challenging. But there are some key things that we look for when we're identifying trees. We're looking for certain characteristics, right? Whether that be the bark, the buds, the leaves, the fruit, the flowers, all of those can really aid us in identifying the trees. So when you're taking pictures, those are some of the things you want to make sure that you're capturing. It's also helpful to kind of get the overall shape of that tree and its size. So if you can get a landscape kind of shot of that tree and its environment, that's helpful. But really close images of the leaves, the buds, the twigs, all of those are really going to be the clues that anybody who's trying to identify the tree would really need to try to make sure that they get you the right tree. And again, it can be challenging, not only with our 120 plus native trees, but as you mentioned, Ellen, there's a lot of trees that are just planted in the landscape from all over the world. So it can be tough.
Yeah, and with trees, the one of the things I think that's can frequently throw people off is they might take a picture of the bark, but the bark is tricky, especially if you're not standing right there. But what could be really useful would be something like the twigs. How are those buds arranged? Are they opposite? Are they alternate? The leaves, not just a leaflet, like an individual leaflet, but the whole leaf. What does it look like? Where is it in the landscape? What is its form? There's a lot of questions that I would have if I were trying to help someone identify something. And the more information you can gather on the front end, the better somebody can be to help you with that, which takes us to the next point. If you're trying to figure out what the trees that you have are or other plants, using all the resources that you have. I think for anybody, and you'll hear this again, your best resource is your county extension agent, your county extension office. They are there in your county. They have agents who are really knowledgeable about many different things and are there to assist. So I really encourage folks to reach out to them. But when it comes to kind of tree ID, there's also a lot of fantastic other resources. There are great books, but there's also great websites, apps, social media groups and pages for identification that I encourage you to check out. There are some that, you snap a picture and it tries to identify it for you. Now, it may not always be right, so take it with a grain of salt, but it might be a good starting place for you thinking about what it is. And then there are some other apps that are kind of like a whole book in an app, a whole dichotomous key. There's a really good new one out called FloraQuest, but there are lots and lots of them that you should check out and see what you like. So just wanted to encourage you in your trying to figure out what you've got to use all those resources. Are there any others that you really like, Billy?
No, the only thing I guess I would mention would be that Laurie Thomas has put together these common trees of Kentucky. So, if you're looking through it, and she's got really good breakdowns of different parts of the trees and stuff too. So you could use that in combination. And we have a publication, FOR1, which is Common Trees of Kentucky and how to know them. And so there are kind of keys and other things. And we have webinars that kind of walk you through the tree ID process. But it can be challenging just to learn, one tree. We really want you to learn that process of tree identification, really. So I would encourage folks, if they want to go down this route and get to really be good at it, take some of our classes or attend some of our webinars on tree identification. And, if you can get out in the woods with a knowledgeable person, that's a great way to really amp up your knowledge real quick.
Oh, I agree. Because there's, I can watch those Tree of the Week videos from Lori. Every one of them is interesting and has new things to learn. And I think that combined with actually going out, using a key in the field, getting more familiar with those characteristics is a great way to increase your knowledge about different trees and how to identify them.
And what a great question to really start this series with, because it really starts with kind of knowing what that tree is, right? Because that's such an important thing in all of these questions we're going to be talking about, right? What's the
All
tree?
right, well,
What do we want?
next question. What tree should I plant? If the first question is what tree is it, the next question I receive a lot of is, all right, well, what tree should I plant? I want to plant some trees. What tree should I plant? And that's tricky, isn't it?
It is very challenging, right? Because again, you have so many different trees. So we really want you to kind of think as you're going through this, why are you planting that tree, right? What do you want that tree to do for you, right? Are you looking for shade? Are you looking for fruit? Are you looking for wildlife benefits? But are you looking for character? All of those things go into selecting the right tree.
Oh yeah, there's no one perfect tree. And I think a lot of folks, there's kind of this tradition, maybe, especially with our landscape trees, of just planting the same species and we'll just get a lot of uniformity. And while aesthetically there is some value to that, the challenge is that every tree has some, different attributes. So if you want a tree that is has no mess and is really easy to care for, that might be different from somebody who wants a tree that's going to produce fruits that they can enjoy with their family. If you want a tree that's fast growing and establishes really quickly, that's not going to be the same tree that's going to live for hundreds of years in your landscape. There's trade-offs there. So there's no one perfect tree out there. It depends on what you want and what your interests are. Because one person's perfect tree could be another person's headache. So
Yeah,
there's no perfect tree.
like you wouldn't want to plant a walnut over your deck, right? You don't want those walnuts and all that debris dropping on you. So
Mhm.
really knowing kind of what you want out of that tree, what kind of benefits you want that tree to provide will really help you narrow down to get a tree that would kind of match your objectives.
Yeah. And then kind of right along with that, in addition to what you want, there's kind of the important part of where it's going, because you might have this very clear vision. I want a big, tall shade tree, um, but it's going right under some power lines. And
Match.
so if that's what you wanted, that is a mismatch there. That's something that's not going to work out long term. And there might be better choices for that site. That's one example with kind of trees in the more landscape setting. Another one would be, let's say you've got a really wet spot that, holds water. You're going to want to put trees there that can tolerate that better. If you've got a tree that really likes to be a little bit drier, it might not die. It might stick in there and do fine. It's just going to be stressed. It's going to be struggling versus you could have set yourself up for more success by matching the the site that you've got. That could be the water, the moisture. It could be the sunlight that's available there. It could be the soil. It could be what else is there. How much space does it have? There are lots of different things that go into what's going to be the right tree for that spot.
Oh, that's a great point, Dr. Crocker. Often I'll get calls from landowners that may be interested in planting walnut, right? They understand that walnut can be a very valuable species and they may want to plant it. But where they're trying to plant it, it may not be the best site
Yeah.
for walnut to be successful. So that's a great point. You got to get the right tree in the right place. That's a common phrase that we use around here. And it makes sense. It really does, because we're trying to give those trees the best opportunity to be successful where they can be competitive for sure.
Definitely. And now, that being said, there are some trees that you might want to avoid. And trees that would be at the top of my list, we mentioned avoiding trees that you just know aren't a good fit for that site. You don't want to set them up for failure and yourself up for failure, because it's time, it's money that goes into that. You don't want to plant a bunch of trees where they're not going to thrive. And at the same time, there are trees that have known issues here. If we're talking about a tree that is known to get a species that is known to have insect and disease problems, it's not going to be long lived. why do that? Why not pick something that's going to be better here at in our location? Another thing that I would really encourage you to avoid are species that are invasive. If we're thinking about things that could be a problem down the road, both on your property, but also elsewhere, wanting to find trees that are non-invasive. We've got so many great native trees to choose from, and there are many for your landscape, especially many great non-native trees that are wonderful ornamental trees that aren't a problem. Let's avoid the invasive ones.
Yes, I mean, we're having enough challenge with those. You don't want to have something that's going to be taking over your yard or your property as well and creating some headaches for you and your neighbors. So, yeah, that's a great point, Dr. Crocker. Make sure we get a tree that's, appropriate for the site for sure.
Yeah, hindsight is 2020. We might not have known when at the time that they were invasive, and you can't do anything about that. But now, we know you don't want those Bradford pears in your landscape. You can do better than that. Same with autumn olive. There was a time when that was considered something that was valuable. But now we know that there are probably better choices. So, and moving on into the next question that we receive a lot of, I'm going to turn it over to Billy for this one.
Yeah, often landowners are interested in their woodlands from a wildlife perspective, right? What wildlife will be interested in coming to my property? They may have an interest to see whether it be deer or birds or whatever on their property. And the question is really it depends, right? It depends a lot on the wildlife that we're looking at, right? What species of wildlife are you trying to attract? So we want to make sure that we have species that are favorable for that. But really, when it comes down to trees and wildlife, a lot of what tree or wildlife is looking for is habitat. It's really all about habitat. So trees, there's a food abundance that trees provide is everywhere in Kentucky. Typically, food is not a limiting factor for many of our wildlife species. It is habitat. So when you think about habitat, you got to think really beyond your property as well. You may be your property may be entirely forested and you have no openings in it, right? That's going to limit some of the species that could be in your woodlands because they may desire an open habitat. So understanding how your property fits in with the landscape and having a diversity of habitats nearby can help you. And the other thing to think about, since trees are such long-lived, we want to get as many benefits and values out of these trees as possible. Fortunately, many of the trees that are good for wildlife are also good for other goals, whether that be timber or recreation. We think of our oaks as being one of the common ones, and they're not only important from a wildlife standpoint, but they're also really one of our more important timber species. So working, making sure that these trees are satisfying as many goals as possible. But again, just don't think about trees solely as like a food source for wildlife. It's as much about the habitat that they create as well. So, working with folks like the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources and their biologists, they can help advise you and guide you on kind of caring for the trees that you currently have and maybe trees that might be attractive for other wildlife.
And I'll just throw in there with the pollinators, I know that's a growing interest as well, especially in our landscape settings. People really wanting to provide support for these insects. I think kind of there's the really charismatic ones like the monarchs and the butterflies, but lots of different kind of important insects that depend on the plants. And I think a lot of times we tend to think of those showy wildflowers, which are wonderful and I love them, but maybe don't fully appreciate the incredible value that trees give us as well. If you think about something like an oak, you mentioned the value of oaks, an oak tree in your landscape can support hundreds of different insect species, even though it's not that they're coming to the flowers, they're feeding on the leaves, they're dependent on that and relying on that, and it can just be so important. So I just wanted to recognize that as well.
Great point.
Yeah, supporting biodiversity in your landscape, in your yard is not just about the flowers. It's about a lot more than that.
Yeah, and we like honey, right? Sourwood honey and other things as well.
Oh yeah.
Trees. So yeah, it's a great point. Yeah, and there's a lot of programs that are available to help. If you're interested in planting trees or pollinator habitat, and we'll talk more about that as we go on.
Great. So the next question that we
Yep.
receive all the time.
Yes. Now,
That
where can I get those
usable.
trees, right? Where can I buy those trees? And there's lots of options, obviously. And what we try to do is we try to really let you think about, what are you trying to do, right? What are you looking for? Are you looking for tree seedlings? Are you looking for a mature tree that's bald and burlapped? It just depends on how many do you need? Are you looking at reforesting a 100-acre field, or is this one tree for your yard? All of those things are kind of things you need to think about, and that will drive where you might go to select a tree. So once you've kind of determined, kind of what size you're looking for, the species, that can kind of further drive you down to where you want to go. One of the places we try to drive people to is the Kentucky Division of Forestry. And you see up here in the upper left-hand photo is a tree seedling bed there at one of the Division of Forestry nurseries. And they provide these very low-cost tree seedlings for the benefit of Kentuckians to get trees in the ground. And it's a tremendous service that the Kentucky Division of Forestry provides. And they make available these really high quality, low cost seedlings that you can buy. You can buy bundles of just one species. You can buy mixes. There's a lot of different options. Now, typically, we will be starting to see the seedling order form open up around the 1st of September. It's currently closed right now. We've kind of passed that tree planting window more or less here in Kentucky, or at the very tail end of it anyway. So if this is something you're wanting to think about long term, now is the time to be thinking about it, right? We need to do some things to make sure that we get those seedlings lined up, but we also have the sites ready, right? Perhaps maybe you're looking for something more for your landscape. You may want in your yard or something. Maybe you want a native tree there. We really recommend that you're planting native species. And one of the best ways you can do that is working with some of our native nurseries here in the state. And there are plenty of native plant nurseries that grow tree seedlings here in Kentucky. So we would encourage you to think about those. There are some other nurseries and retailers as well. The thing you got to be careful with on some of those is just making sure we're not bringing in maybe some invasive plants with that, Dr. Crocker, because sometimes, some of these plants that we would maybe prefer weren't being planted are available at some of these retailers and nurseries.
And maybe some that, like, if you really baby them in your landscape, they'll do great. But when you're talking about planting them in kind of more of a forest or woodland setting, you want something that's going to thrive, that's going to hit the ground running. And our native species, that's what they do. That's what they're used to doing, growing here. You want something that's going to be really well matched to. We have challenging weather. I don't know if you've noticed. Between the ice storms and the cold snaps and the heat, we've got it all. And so it's really good to have something that's familiar with that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And if you are planning on a large tree planting effort, you really need to get ahead of this in advance. We want to make sure that we get that site ready. If you're going to plant trees, it's a long-term proposition. So we want to make sure we're doing it right and getting the right trees in the ground.
And speaking of planting trees, our next question: what else do I need to know about planting trees? So I think you mentioned an important one, that is, it's not as simple as it seems. And the more you can plan on the front end, the better off you're going to be long term. But just to give you some sense of that, there are a lot of different options for planting and how these trees are going to come to you. And how you plant them is going to depend on what you've got. Again, there's no one right choice. Now, there could be better choices and worse choices depending on what you're trying to do. So you might be buying bare root seedlings from the Kentucky Division of Forestry Nursery. Those are going to be coming to you, probably buying a lot of them. Typically a really wonderful tree, a really nice root system, but it's a bare root seedling. So, it's got this potential to dry out fast. If it's not cared for, you're probably going to have more of those trees die just because, they're really young. They don't have soil with them. They might have dried out in the process or something, versus But if you want to plant a whole bunch of them, that's a great, really economical way to do it. It's easy to plant those trees. They typically do really well long term. Versus if you're planting individual tree in your yard, and you're getting one from a local nursery or retailer, you're probably going to get either a container grown tree or a balled and burlapped tree. And those are going to, have more soil around that root ball there. But there's challenges that go along with that as well, both in terms of unpacking all of that. So if you've got a balled and burlapped tree, you want to make sure that you really remove that packaging material. You dig down and find the root flare there, that you set your tree up for success long term, because those are big, heavy trees that typically are much more expensive. So you really want to take care of those trees, take care of those individual trees. And then, I know we're talking about planting trees, but what about natural regeneration? Do you
Yeah,
really need to?
yeah, I wanted to mention that. Thank you so much, Ellen. If you're trying to plant trees in an area that currently has trees, you can do it. And what we call that is kind of an enrichment planting. Maybe you're trying to plant trees where maybe you don't have a certain species that you're interested in and you want it there and it's suited to be there. But for whatever reason, it's not, maybe past land management. The thing you have to recognize is it's going to be much more challenging to plant in areas that have trees in them. And so controlling that competition is going to be a challenge, because you're dealing with trees that have giant root systems versus maybe that little seedling you're talking about that has just a little tiny root system to drive on. So that is something that can be done, but you're going to have to work at it. The other thing is, here in Kentucky, oftentimes people think, well, we've cut the trees down, now we have to replant. And really, we don't do that largely in the state of Kentucky. Most of what we rely on, at least in our woodlands, is natural regeneration. The trees that are out there, they will sprout back. The seedlings that are already present, the seeds that are in the ground, they are that natural regeneration that will take over that site after a timber harvest. We can do things that can culture that to get the right species, right? So working with professionals is really an important thing if you're going to rely on natural regeneration.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I do get that question a lot of, oh, don't we need to plant the trees? And isn't that's a wonderful thing about where we are? A lot of times they'll plant themselves better than we could. It just, you need to
Mowing,
make
right?
sure it's what you want. So other key considerations when thinking about planting trees are the kind of when and how of this.
Right.
Because there are better times of the year to do this. Typically, fall and spring are considered really good times of the year to plant trees, because, in large part, because of water. One of the biggest challenges facing newly planted trees is that they've got this root system that really is compromised by that whole process, and we can help them out. And those are two good times of year to do that, where they're less likely, if you plant them in the middle of the summertime, to just dry out and have that be a problem. How really depends on what you've got. Do you have bare root seedlings? Do you have the container grown trees? There's a lot of different techniques there. And I encourage you just to research that before, planting them all and then realizing, oh, I planted them all too deep. They're all 6 inches too deep. And now they're either going to be stressed, or I'm going to have to go back and fix that. You don't want to be in that position. Yeah, do some research on the front end. And then, kind of related to that, new tree care. Those new trees are amazingly resilient and strong. But the most kind of delicate phase that they go through is those first few years. When you plant a tree, that first year is really important. So if these are trees in your landscape, you've invested all this time and money into planting those, make sure that you water them when there's a drought or dry periods in the summer. Make sure that you mulch around the base to prevent damage from mowers or weed whackers. Similarly, if we're talking about trees in your woods, there's a lot you can also be doing, right, Billy?
Oh, certainly. Yeah. We want to make sure, especially if we're planting trees in the woods, that we are controlling that competition. We want to make sure that we've taken care of and scouted for invasive plants that could threaten the survivability of those species. So you really have to nurture these trees those first few years to get them established. Typically, once our trees, if you're planting in an open field, once they kind of establish a little canopy, if you will, they're going to be okay and they'll be able to kind of survive on their own. But until we get them up to that point, they're going to need a little bit of support and help. So, make sure you get them off to a good start. As you said, it's a big investment to plant trees. We want to make sure that we get the outcomes that we're looking for.
Wonderful. So another question that I commonly receive is, what's wrong with my tree?
Yes, I bet you get
And
lots of those because I know I get a lot, and you're a forest health expert, so I'm sure you get even more.
well, and it's tough because for me, yeah, I know it's tough for everyone because even for me, I'll get some photos of something and it's really hard to diagnose tree issues. Period, but especially from photos. And so everything we talked about for tree ID applies for what's wrong with my tree as well. If you've got something wrong, whoever you're sharing that with needs to know, what does it look like when it's normal? So what's normal for this tree, and how is this different from that? And good photos of what's going on there might help. There are lots of really great resources available too, to assist you in that process, that we already discussed and we'll chat more about. But the same ones for Tree ID. Your county agents are just a wonderful starting place there. But one thing that I want to point out when what's wrong with my tree comes up is there are many insects and diseases out there that can impact trees and make them look bad. But the good news is that most of these are minor. So the leaves might look bad, but they're not going to really hurt the health of the tree long term. But it's super important in my mind to distinguish those from the kind of relatively fewer number of things that can kill healthy trees. Now, a lot of the times those tend to be our invasive insects and diseases that can just rapidly kill a healthy tree. But maybe kind of the most common thing I see is site and care issues. So if you've got a tree that's stressed, you're going to get preventable problems. And so sometimes I'll receive, what's wrong with my tree? Here's a photo of what's going on. And I can see that thing that's going on there. But what I don't know about is what happened that led to this. Because maybe that by itself wouldn't be a major issue, but because you've got a tree that's really stressed, all of a sudden you're getting a lot of opportunistic problems that normally the tree would be able to defend itself, or they reflect a problem in the tree. So if I'm seeing a tree that has hypoxylon canker, yeah, it has hypoxylon canker, but the bigger problem is that that tree is so stressed that this is happening. And what's causing that? Was it, some damage to that tree, some wounding that created that condition? Or is this something that you can treat, that is something that you can directly address? Or is this more something that you can prevent in the future? Those are all questions that I would think about when thinking about what's wrong with my tree. And then the other kind of related question that I get a lot of is, is this tree a hazard? Is this tree gonna fall down? And the challenge with that is that, yes, it is.
Eventually.
All trees are going to fall down at some point. They are living organisms just like us, and they come with an expiration date.
Yep.
But that's not what you want to know. You want to know is, in the short term, is this a problem? Should you do something about it? And it really depends. There are many factors that go into that. I think the most important too is, if all trees are going to eventually fall down, what kind of timeline are we talking about? Are we talking about 10 years? Are we talking about a year? What's the likelihood of that? And then what happens if it does fail? Is it going to fall in the woods with no problem and it's not a big deal at all? Versus, is this over your house, over a playground? What's going to happen? What's the potential to do damage there? And there are trained professionals, arborists that have tree risk assessment certification. And I really encourage you to consider that if you're trying to assess whether a tree is a hazard or not, working with a professional on that. They have training that can address those two different components. While, the future is impossible to predict, that kind of expertise can be really valuable and is not something that someone's going to be able to do over an email.
Yeah, you want to make sure somebody really knows what they're looking at and doing if there's something
Oh,
to be
yeah,
damaged.
for sure, for sure. Because trees are the answer, but sometimes they can be a problem too. So the next question that we wanted to talk about, and I'll turn it back over to Billy for this one as well, is
Okay, yeah,
how
thank you.
do you care for the trees that you do have?
Right. We have so many trees here in Kentucky. Nearly half the state is covered in woodlands or trees. And, most of us have trees in our yards or lawns. So trees are everywhere, right? And we get a lot of benefits and values. So certainly there are some benefits for caring for our trees, right? Because of those values and benefits that we derive from trees, caring for them, making sure that they're healthy and vigorously growing will help ensure that those benefits continue to flow to us. The other thing is you got to think about the future trees, and especially when we're in a woodland setting. One of the things that foresters need to be thinking about and woodland owners is what's that next generation looking like, right? What is a next forest going to look like, or what is my woodland going to look like in the future? We have to be always planning in advance for that. So foresters and woodland owners should spend as much time looking up as they do looking down and seeing what's going on the ground and getting established. And that leads you into, if you're a woodland owner, we really encourage you to get a woodland management plan or woodland stewardship plan. And this is a plan where a professionals come out and met with you and talked about your objectives for your property. And then they do a cursory inventory of your property and they let you know what you have. They let you know if you've got any issues or challenges that are going on, whether it's invasive species, trespass, or other things that may be a challenge on your property. And then they can help come up with prescriptions to help you deal with those issues. And oftentimes, Dr. Crocker, they can not only provide that technical assistance, they can connect you to financial assistance to get some of that work done. So if you're a woodland owner, one of the best ways to care for your trees is to have this management plan and a relationship with a professional forester. And we'll talk about some of those that are available, but there's a lot that are here in Kentucky that you can work with. Now, the next thing, again, what is your plan for the future, right? We've got a crop of trees there now, but we've got to think about that next issue, right, or the next crop. And what we're trying to do is think about, are there any issues that we're dealing with? Are we not getting the species to develop like we want? If that's the case, then we might need to get in there and do some culturing of those other trees to make sure that we kind of get the trees that we want. And really it lends us to the thought of gardening. I know I'm an avid gardener, a hobby gardener,
You have a really good garden.
but
Everyone be jealous of Billy's
no,
garden. It's
I
nice.
love gardening, but really, and forestry, maybe I like gardening so much because it's like forestry, right? Because really it's about tending to that garden a little bit. If you think of your woodlands as a garden, there's only so much growing space, and sometimes we may not want some of the weeds that are in there. So it's about tending to your garden, and think of your woodlands as that. And they're going to be more productive and they're going to be more healthy if we do care for them. So we really encourage you, not only think about planting trees, but also think about caring for the trees that we currently have, because we've got a lot of them here in the state. And if we care for them, they're going to be healthier and more productive.
Well, speaking of productive in those trees, next
Oh,
question to you, Billy. How much are my trees worth?
Dr. Crocker, this may be the number one question that I receive. And it really, the answer is it depends, right? And that's not the answer most people want to hear. They don't want to hear it depends. But the truth is, it really does depend. Sometimes people may be selling a tree that's in their yard, or they may have 1,000 acres of trees. And what you can get for each individual tree in those settings is going to vary widely, right? I will tell you that a lot of times I do get calls from landowners say, I've got a tree, it may be sick, or I need to move it, or, I need to take it down for whatever reason. Who will buy it from me? And there may be some people out there, but I will let people know it is challenging to sell yard trees kind of in that traditional sense, like we sell woodland trees. And there's a few reasons. I think if you think about it, it'll make sense. For one, you're asking a logging crew, if you will, to come and maybe cut down one tree. So that's really expensive from a equipment and people movement sense. So that's challenging. The other thing is those folks really aren't trained to deal with kind of urban issues, right? In yard trees, they're not trained to deal with utility lines or trees that might fall on a house or a car or a fence or whatever else, right? And the other thing is a lot of our yard trees end up having metal or other things that have been embedded in them. And now maybe you didn't do it as the owner of that tree, but whoever owned it before you or somebody else may have put some metal or other things, whether it's a nail or something in there. And these saws that the mills are using are so expensive. And to ruin a saw on one, one nail or whatever is just not worth it, right? So a lot of times they don't even want to touch the yard trees because of that risk. So I will tell you, it is a challenge. If you do have yard trees you're trying to sell, your best bet is to try to find somebody local that can maybe process that and harvest that. We do have a lot of folks in Kentucky that have portable sawmills, and they may have a little more experience dealing with kind of individual trees. Now, when it comes to woodland trees, that's a whole nother issue, right? And there we need to talk about a lot of different things. You know, how many trees do you have? What's the species, right? Not all trees are commercially valuable from a timber standpoint. So if you have a bunch of hackberry, then the chance of it being very valuable compared to like a white oak is not very good. Also, the quality matters, right? It's a much easier to get high quality wood products out of high quality trees than it is out of, you know, hollow crooked trees, right? It just doesn't work. And then the other thing is the quantity. There has to be enough quantity to kind of justify bringing a logging operation in on that property. I will tell you that we kind of, as a ballpark number, use here in Kentucky, you're looking around maybe 3,500 board feet per acre that's getting harvested. And, you know, we can expect landowners to receive somewhere in the $1,000 to $1,300 range for that. So it gives you some idea if you've got pretty good stuff out there. But the challenge is it varies, because Dr. Crocker, not every mill is looking for every species, right? And that's the challenge. If you don't do good merchandising of your trees, you're not going to be able to find that highest value for them. So there's some folks, and we'll talk about a little later, that can kind of help you navigate that process. And I would encourage you to do that. And one of the things you also have to think about, what's going to happen to that property afterwards. Oftentimes people say, I've got a woodland and, you know, I need some money and I need to get something out of that. I asked them what is going to happen to that land afterward, right? If that land is going to stay in trees and forests, then we really want to do it in a very thoughtful way. We want to make sure that we are planning for that future forest, and the way that we harvest and when we harvest can have huge implications on what trees will be successful on that site. So working with professionals, Dr. Crocker, is really going to be the best way that folks are going to not only get the highest dollar value from the trees, but they're more likely to end up with a woodland that they're pleased with, and it's going to be set up for future success.
Definitely. Yeah, that's what you want. Long term is
Right. It's a long-term
success.
enterprise, but do it right.
Whether you want to grow trees or do something else after that, like
Yeah.
if there's a lot you can do on the front end to set yourself up for success down the road. And related to this, I think you get a lot of questions about how to sell some of that.
Yep. Yeah. Once they kind of figure out, all right, I might have some value in the trees. Now I go, how do I sell it? Right. What do I do? What's that process? And what should I be thinking about? And there's a lot to it. There really is. And we're just going to be able to hit the surface on this. But one of the first things I always encourage folks to do is plan well in advance. We spend a lot of time and energy growing trees. And if we're going to harvest them, we want to do it very thoughtfully. And we want to make sure that we're doing it in the right way. So you want to make sure that we are set up for regeneration. If we harvest that, or the baby trees or other natural regeneration there to occupy that site and take over like we want. If so, that's great, right? Do we have the right infrastructure in place? Do you have roads or other access to get to the trees? If not, that may be something that can either be done as part of the timber harvest, and you can work that into the contract, or it can be stuff that's done in advance. Another one, not invasive plants, that should be invasive plants. Or
invasive planning is always good though, because you need to plan for invasive plants for sure.
Plan for invasive plants, because if we get in there and we harvest an area that is has a lot of invasive plant pressure, there's a high likelihood that those invasive plants are going to occupy that site, and then you just kind of created a problem. So we want to make sure that we have that in thought. So it's not just a matter of running out and cutting the trees down, right? You also want to be thinking a little bit about markets and timing and stuff like that. That can matter a lot. The other thing is, if you're going to sell this, somebody's going to know, well, what do you have, right? Do you, and you not only do you need to know what you have, but you also need to know who will buy it, right? And finding those buyers is sometimes can be the same as finding the same people that are harvested. It may be the same person, but sometimes it may not be. It just depends. And you need to know how you're going to be paid. Are you going to get paid all at once, or you're going to get paid on a shares basis? There's advantages and disadvantages to both, but you need to kind of understand those things. You got to know what you have. You got to have some idea of what its value is, so you know what's kind of a fair price. But again, you need to be able to navigate. And we'll talk a little bit more, Dr. Crocker, about some of the folks at the end that can kind of help, navigate this process. The other thing I would really encourage, you need to follow our Kentucky Forest Best Management practices. Those are in place and they're required by law. Any commercial timber harvest has to have a Kentucky master logger on site and in charge of that logging operation. And that's there in place to make sure that we're not doing damage largely to the water here in the state. And so you want to make sure that we have that in place. So make sure you're working with reputable folks. You would not want to be working with a bad actor that's on that list. And we have some folks that kind of have gotten in trouble for maybe doing some things they shouldn't have been. And we wouldn't really, want to be working with those. And finally on this, again, there's a lot to this, and it's something you shouldn't be taking lightly. I encourage you to take and get a contract, right? That way everybody is on the same page. We know all the details. We're all in agreement on that. And we're not kind of resorting back to, well, I thought you said this. And then you say, well, no, I really said this. And so then we're in a point of confusion, and people are not going to be happy with kind of what happens there. So make sure you've got a contract and everybody knows what's what. Let your neighbors know what's going on. Be a good neighbor. Let them know that you're harvesting. And it's also part of that the timber trespass law can leave some cost to you if you have some timber trespass issues off your property. If you've alerted them in advance, that can protect you as well. Think about the tax implications. Are you selling those as ordinary income, or is that as a capital gains? That has serious tax implications. Consulting foresters, accountants, and others can help you kind of navigate that. And then please don't forget to just follow up afterwards. Just because you cut it doesn't mean you're done, right? We want to get back in there. We want to make sure that those woodlands are developing in the way that we planned and intended. And sometimes you may have to do a few little practices here or there to make sure you get that. If you can, I encourage folks to set aside some of that revenue from that timber harvest to pay, not only for taxes, but also for some of that follow-up work or infrastructure work that needs to be done.
Wonderful. So one more question.
Yeah.
Who can help with my trees?
There's
There's so many.
There's a lot. There's really a lot. And this always makes you feel good because you're not alone, right? You can get some help. And we've got a list here that we're going to share with you. And there's lots of them, folks. There really are. One of the places we'll encourage you to start with is kind of the clearinghouse for all knowledge is our county extension agents, right? They are positioned quite well across Kentucky to be there for you. They can connect with us. They also know many of the other foresters that are out in the state of Kentucky. We have foresters that are with the Kentucky Division of Forestry that can work with you. We have private consulting foresters that are part of the Kentucky Association of Consulting Foresters. Our Natural Resource Conservation Service here in Kentucky is actually employing foresters as well that are available to work with you. We have a number of groups here in Kentucky, from like the Rough Grouse Society to Wild Turkey Federation, that have been hiring foresters because they recognize the importance of forestry and trees to wildlife as well. We also have our Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. They have biologists that are available to work with landowners one-on-one, and they can help you deal with issues that are interacting with trees and wildlife for sure. So that's a great resource that we want to take advantage of. I did mention NRCS. Not only can they provide that technical assistance, but they can also provide financial assistance to offset the cost of doing that. And they do that because we recognize that society benefits when we care and manage for our trees and natural resources. So they're in place to help our private landowners do that because society always wins. And then Dr. Crocker, I know this is a group you work a lot with, or arborists, and they deal a little bit more in kind of, maybe not in the woodland setting, but maybe more in a little urban.
Definitely. If you've got questions about trees in your landscape, I really encourage you to work with a knowledgeable tree professional. I hear a lot of cases where, someone's going door to door offering services at a price that seemed too good to be true. And, you get what you pay for in some cases. If you've got somebody who doesn't know what they're doing, they can do a lot of damage to those landscape trees that are really valuable to you, both in terms of the economic value of those trees that they bring your property, but also the aesthetic value, the benefits they give you every day. And so arborists are trained professionals that are paid professionals that you can hire for a wide range of different services. And I encourage you, you can check out a list of arborists in your area. Working with a knowledgeable tree professional is extremely valuable, whether we're talking about foresters in your woods or an arborist in your landscape.
Yeah, trees are such a valuable asset. We want to care for them, and we encourage you all to do the same. So.
Wonderful. Well, with that, that was a whirlwind tour of the top 10 issues that we hear from that landowners face. I'm sure there are others, though. And so if you've got questions, you can put that in the chat.
Yeah.
No, that was amazing. That I loved that. It's answers to questions that people have. You touched on the surface on some of them, but you have to. I mean, time wise, but it's great. And if anybody has questions, they can just email us and at forestry .extension@uky.edu, and we will get those answered for them. But that was awesome, you all. But thank you so much. We greatly appreciate you both doing that for us.
Thank you.
Yeah, and one of the things we were talking about was wildlife and trees.
Exactly.
We have some
segue here.
of Cody Jarrett from the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. Hey, Cody, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing good. How are you, Billy?
Doing well, sir. Doing well.
So you're going to have a workshop going on?
Yep. In Mercer County, the Department of Fish and Wildlife is hosting a workshop for private landowners on May the 20th. And it's going to be from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. Lunch will be provided. And we're just going to walk a private landowner's property that's done some cedar harvest already and kind of talk about how to manage after the fact and kind of what it looks like and get people familiar with kind of going through that process. So there'll be master loggers on site to kind of talk about the value of different size cedars and how the market is today and things like that. So they'll be there as well.
Let's watch your presentation.
You got me there, Renee?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, so like I said, my name is Cody Jarrett. I'm a private lands biologist with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, and I'm here today to kind of speak on behalf of the workshop that we have going on. And usually, if I give this presentation kind of in person, I like to ask the room kind of who thinks cedars are good habitat, and it always surprises me how half the room or whatever will raise their hand and they'll say, yeah, that's where my deer bed, that's the best pocket of habitat that I have on my whole property. And research has shown that that's not true, and that actually by cutting the cedars down and implementing things like prescribed fire, we can actually increase the carrying capacity on our farms, increase the forage available to not only deer, but kind of looking at it from a holistic view, all the flowering plants that come on the forbs, they're going to attract pollinators, butterflies, ground nesting birds, things like that. So I have a pretty simple picture here that I like this slide because working with Fish and Wildlife, I'm also an affiliate with NRCS. And like Billy had mentioned, there's cost share opportunities through the NRCS that if you have a thicket of cedar trees and you've been thinking about wanting to remove them, there's actually cost share money available to help you get that done, whether you're paying an independent contractor to come out and cut those cedars, or if you look at it like this, you could potentially sell those cedars to a logger and then also get paid from NRCS. So you could kind of double dip. So taking a step back though, I like thinking of the brief history of Kentucky's native landscape. And if you read some of the kind of the early explorers journals when they were coming across Kentucky, if you look on the map here, it's kind of highlighted Kentucky as savanna land and good pasture ground. And a lot of times we think of like East Kentucky, like mature hardwood forests. And the early explorers have actually documented that's not exactly the habitat that we had in those times. It was actually more prairies and open ground. And the reason for that was because it was determined 600 generations of Native Americans lived here before European settlement occurred in the 1400s. And I think it was like the Shawnee and the Iroquois Native Americans, they actually call it Kentucky, Kaintucky, and Kentucky. And though that means a place of fields, a level place, and a peaceful meadow. And so kind of how that relates to cedar trees is the Native Americans were using prescribed fire. And prescribed fire is an awesome tool for managing eastern red cedar because it's not fire tolerant. Whereas like your oaks and your hickories, they are fire tolerant species. Cedar tree can't handle a fire. So when the Native Americans would light fires, be it kind of herd buffalo toward a cliff edge, like indicated in that picture there, or they knew the kind of the value of the next growing season. Whenever you burn off the land and you get that new flush of vegetation, the buffalo would return to those grounds the next year and provide them more hunting opportunity. And then if you look at after early settlement, we stopped with the prescribed fire. We had Smokey the Bear campaign. So a lot of people quit using fire. And now if you look at this map of the home range of eastern red cedar today, it takes up most of the eastern United States and all of Kentucky. I've got a graph here in the red. You'll see this is a really good graph to show kind of the management of cedar or the lack of management and what you can expect in response. So this red line, time without cedar management, as that increases, you can see obviously the percent of cedar cover increases. And then the inverse of that is if you have a bunch of cedar trees and then you manage them, the herbaceous response increases. So that's kind of where NRCS comes in. If we can come in and help incentivize landowners to cut these trees and get more of that herbaceous response, increase the carrying capacity on your property, then you'll have a lot more habitat. Here's some pictures. There's some foxglove, beard tongue, a bunch of wildflowers. There's some patches of native grass, goldenrod. This is kind of what you can expect whenever you harvest cedar trees, because a lot of times these sites are going to be shallow soils where the cedars are growing, or they could just be overgrown pastures where you kind of took the bush hog out and you just let them go fallow. The eastern red cedar can grow like 24 inches in a single year under optimal growing conditions. So within 5 years, you could have a 10-foot cedar tree. And those cedar trees, they self-prune once they mature. You'll see like the bottom limbs, they will die and they'll kind of fall off the cedar tree. And that's because sunlight's not getting to those bottom limbs once they kind of mature and get bigger. And whenever they grow in big thickets, they completely shade out the ground. So you'll have nothing underneath the understory except for cedar needles. Or if you cut those, a lot of times these seed banks are undisturbed. They haven't been farmed for crops. They haven't ever seen a plow. So a lot of the native seed is still in the seed bank, and it's there ready to express itself as soon as you open it up to sunlight. So you can have responses like this. And I think they talked earlier in the presentation, I think Ellen mentioned this, how the pollinator blends and stuff, pollinator plantings are becoming more and more popular. You could do this for free and potentially get paid for it through NRCS and get all these pollinators to come out without ever purchasing the first seed. So here's a cool picture of turkey and some coneflowers and some black-eyed Susan. It's excellent brood-rearing habitat for turkey and quail. These high diversity forage mixes that you can expect as a response from removing cedars attracts a lot of diversity of insects, which turkey broods need. They need that high protein diet whenever they're turkey poults, whenever they can't fly. They need that high protein diet to help them get to where they can escape predation and fly. Here are some photos of just kind of how do you remove the cedar trees. So like once I can convince a landowner that cedar trees are bad, or maybe they've done their own research and they realize, hey, I've got a lot of cedars. Now, how do I get rid of them? there's a lot of different options. I think there's a series of photos here that show like heavy equipment, like skidders and skid steers with masticators on the front or forestry mulchers. You can do these things, and especially if you're going to harvest them. If you have a mill nearby that's accepting cedar trees and there's actually a market for it, you can get them to come in and do this with heavier equipment, or you could just come in with a chainsaw. I mean, it's very cost effective. You could pay a crew. You could go through NRCS, get them to pay you to remove them, and then you take that money and pay a contracted crew to come in with chainsaws and cut them down. And then obviously once you cut the cedars down, whatever means you use to do that, you're going to have a bunch of slash on the ground. And what I like to recommend is if you can pile them, then, and you're not comfortable prescribed fire, piling them is the best way. And I recommend that a lot, especially landowners, like I say, that aren't familiar with prescribed fire. You can pile these up, let them sit for a couple of years, and then on a snowy day in December, you can burn this while there's no available fuel in the surrounding area and safely burn these piles off. Or a lot of people like to just drop the cedar trees within the burn unit. If they're going to burn it afterwards, just drop the cedar trees and let them set for a year or two, and then run a prescribed fire through and let the fire kind of consume some of those cedar skeletons. And then you're kind of putting the nutrients back on the site. Instead of pulling them off and piling them, you can just burn them within the unit and restore all those nutrients back to the site. And then obviously this is on a different site, but again, here's kind of the results you can expect. You can see all the big blue stem in the background. It's a native warm season grass, clump forming grass, which is different than our fescue and our cool seasons that are kind of sod forming. You get these native grasses to establish. And like I say, it's excellent turkey brood rearing cover. It's excellent bedding cover for deer. Your pollinators are going to come use this. All your ground nesting birds are going to use this. Whereas if you hadn't done that, you would have nothing but cedar needles on the ground. Here's a cool little diagram. It's the cedar log scale, and it kind of shows the 2/3 rule. And you basically look at the diameter in inches of your log, and then how long it is, and it'll kind of tell you how many board feet you can expect to get. Not like I don't use this a lot in my job, but it is interesting to look at and think about if you're going to have a cedar harvest. And then here is the cedar management workshop that I was talking about at the beginning. It's going to be in Mercer County on May the 20th. And we're going to have, like I said, we're going to have master loggers that are on site to kind of answer any questions as far as the value of cedar trees, whether you're selling it to a pulp market or you're going to do a timber harvest on it. And then also we're going to talk about invasive species management, which I guess I didn't have a slide in this presentation. I thought there was one, but like we talked about it before, if you're going to cut a tree, you need to think about what the response is going to be. Yeah, you're going to have native seed bank there, but you may also have autumn olive and bush honeysuckle, Japanese honeysuckle, multiflora rose, your Bradford pears. You need to be thinking about those, and if you want to attack them before you do the harvest, or if you have a plan to come back immediately the next year and kind of go at them that way. But make sure you're thinking about invasive species management, and of course, we're going to talk about that during the workshop. So we'll talk about controlled burning. Jacob Stewart's big into the Prescribed Fire Council. He's the vice president, and we do a lot of burning across the state. So Mr. Pinkston, who's the landowner here that's on the map here on Google Earth, it's going to be on his farm, and we may actually end up writing a burn plan for him and trying to do a prescribed fire out there. Cutting the cedar trees is awesome, and that's one step, but we got to think about the future management. Herbicide treatments on the invasives. If you don't get the response you want, maybe it was an old field that had been, maybe it used to be cropped or something, and it had been sprayed year after year, and the native seed bank had been disturbed. Maybe you go in and you do a pollinator planting, or you plant species that you want. Maybe you go in there and plant native shrubs. Or if you do get the response, you think about the control burning. So here is a list of private lands biologists. I cover kind of olive area too. So if you have any questions, you can reach out as far as NRCS goes, programs go. If you have some cedars that you want harvested, and you have questions about maybe applying for an equip contract or something, you can reach out to any of these biologists listed here.
That was a great presentation as well. Thank you so much for doing that. We really appreciate that. And we did have a question that came through. They wanted to know do cedar stumps need to be treated to prevent resprouting?
No, they do not. So that's a good thing about cedar trees. If you cut them below the bottom limb, they will not sprout back like your hardwood species would. And that's a good thing too with prescribed fire. If you can run a fire through there and top kill them, they won't sprout back. So.
Okay.
Well,
So this is, people shouldn't do that though. Like they shouldn't just, okay, I'm going to get something. I'm going to cut all these down and then I'm going to light them up. They shouldn't do that, right?
No, do not do that. Reach out to me or another private lands biologist in your county. Reach out to maybe your division of forestry. If you have a forester in your county, reach out to us and we can help kind of write you a burn plan. And we do like we're doing a cedar management workshop on May the 20th, but we've done a lot of learning burns across the state. So we had one in Marion County, Sisters of Laredo, where we bring landowners out and we conduct a prescribed fire and let them kind of walk through the process and get more experience doing it. So then they kind of see the logistics of it and how to do it in a safe manner. And then they can do it on their own properties.
Nice. Nice.
Cool stuff, Cody, man. I really appreciate you giving this presentation, but also just the organization. The Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources is an amazing organization for our landowners here in the state. You all do such great work. So a big shout out to all of you all for that great work. Thank you very much.
Yep, thank you.
Awesome show today, Billy.
Yeah, good stuff. We covered a lot of ground.
Yeah. We really did. We really did. So, this really helped, I think, a lot of people to understand what to do with their trees. And then also if they have cedar and wanted to get rid of them, I mean, that worked out just as well.
Yeah, no doubt. And if there's something you all would like to see on a future episode, let us know. We have a little survey that you can complete on FromTheWoodsToday.com. You can let us know what you think about the show, but also maybe you've got something cool in your woods that you're seeing. A lot of stuff's out there growing right now and flowering. So maybe it's something new. Be on the lookout for that. Maybe it's an invasive plant or something else. But get out there and enjoy your property and let us know if you have some questions or stuff you'd like to see us cover.
And next week, we're going to talk about wildfire response. So, there we go. We can, they're talking about fire, so we can get some information on that. So we appreciate you joining us, and we will see you next week at 11 o'clock. Take care. Bye.
From the woods today.